My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
But it was dangerous to leave them unemployed, because unemployed intellectuals would sooner or later organize a revolution. So he employed them in government and built the largest bureaucracy that you can conceive of. Now, he had a bunch of subordinates who were better educated and smarter than him. And they didn't like his policies. What happened? No manager can effectively implement a policy that smarter subordinates can't subvert. He can't keep in touch with everything they do. And by God, they can keep anything he wants to do from being done in very subtle ways that he can never trace down completely. And that was his problem. The problem is he never made a distinction between power over and power to. You see, power over is the exercise of authority. Power to is the exercise of influence. The more educated subordinates are, the less effective the exercise of authority is. But the more effective influence is. He did not make the conversion from ruling by authority to ruling by influence. You see, the President of the United States has absolutely no authority over me. The Shah of Iran could have me killed, even though I'm a foreigner walking down the street in Iran. The President can't do anything to me. But he can influence me, and he can potentially influence me much more than the Shah ever could, because I didn't agree with the Shah either. So, how do we develop a government which deals by efforts to influence people who know more than we do about what they're doing? It's another question. The third question that arises is this concept of ownership, which we've already discussed. As we move to thinking of a corporation as a community, the concept of ownership disappears. Yeah.
I'm still curious. You didn't tell us how you gave your final output to Shaw's wife in your findings.
Well, we gave him advice which he didn't follow.
Oh, okay.
We told him to create a democratic monarchy, create a Supreme Court, and appoint himself the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and take himself out of the government otherwise.
Did they keep serving you tea and sweets? Or
did they what?
Did they continue serving you tea and sweets, or did that stop?
No, it was only about a month later that the revolution occurred.
Oh, boy.
They didn't have to worry about it. Okay. The changing concept of ownership we've already discussed. As you move to a community, it becomes irrelevant. The management of interactions we've also discussed. And the last point is a critical one. In 1975-76, I spent a sabbatical year in Mexico and returned to the United States in the end of August of 1976 in the middle of the bicentennial celebration. And the bicentennial celebration was centered in Philadelphia because that's where the Declaration of Independence and Constitution had been written. And we had all kinds of events going on. So when I met my first class, 2 weeks after I returned from Mexico, they were all full of the celebration. So I asked them to take out a sheet of paper and each one write down their definition of democracy. And they all did that. And we read their definitions, and it became apparent that there was no agreement on what democracy was. And that seemed odd, since here we were as a nation celebrating it, and nobody agreeing on what it was that we were celebrating. So we decided that it was important to spend time trying to find a definition of democracy that we could all agree to. This is what we came up with. In a democracy, everyone affected by a decision can participate directly or indirectly through representation in making that decision. So if you can't participate in making the decision, you can elect the person who will represent you in making that decision. It's participative decision making. The second condition is everyone in a position of authority over others is subject to their collective authority. That means if I have authority over each of you separately, say I can fire you because I'm your boss, then you collectively must be able to fire me. That's what happened with Nixon. The people who elected him put him out of office. In a democracy, authority is circular, not linear. Okay? Third condition. Anybody can do whatever he or she wants to do, providing it affects no others or affects them only with their approval. So I can't do anything which affects you legally without your permission or tolerance of it. If I try to do something you don't want me to do, you can take legal action against me. That's the essential characteristic of democracy. Now, how do we introduce democracy into a corporation? It's done by observing one fundamental characteristic of a corporation, and that is that every organization, public or private, for-profit or not-for-profit, has a board. Now, the interesting thing about boards is nobody's ever questioned the value of a board. You may say this board is no good, but they don't say boards are no good. The board is a useful concept because it's the interaction between the management of an organization and its environment. That's its role, to produce that connection between the two. Suppose, since the board is a good idea, what we do is give every manager a board. If it's good for the CEO, why isn't it good for every manager? Well, let's see what happens if we do. Now we've got two questions. Who will be on the board, and what do the boards do? Well, we should be able to talk about them simultaneously, but we can't, so let's first talk about participation. Every manager has a board consisting minimally, and I want to stress the word minimally for the present. That manager is on his own board. His immediate boss is on his board. Why? Because whatever the board does, it could come in conflict with his boss, and you can avoid that by having his boss on his board. And his immediate subordinates are on the board. So every manager has a board that minimally consists of himself, his immediate boss, and his immediate subordinates. But every board has the freedom to select other members inside or outside the organization on the board and to establish the conditions. I mentioned yesterday that I'm on 3 corporate boards, and everyone is different. On one board, I have no vote. I am used only as an advisor on issues they think I know something about. But I sit there and wait until they ask me a question. In another board, I am allowed to vote in a certain domain of issues, but not all. The third board, I vote on everything, like a vice president. That's up to the board. They invite me to participate and set the conditions. There's one constraint. The representatives of any group invited to participate in the board cannot exceed the number of subordinates on the board. So if I have 8 subordinates and they're all on my board, then the number of representatives of my customers and my suppliers cannot be as high as 8. It can be up to 7. For reasons I'll show you in a moment, the subordinates must be the plurality on a board. Okay. Now, look at the system. I have to go up. This is a simple picture of a 3-level organization that shows you what this looks like. If you look at manager of unit 1.1 and his board is shown over here, then he is a member of his board, his boss is a member of his board, and his immediate subordinates are members of his board. Now, think of these three levels. It's out of the middle of a big corporation going up and down. So that, for example, I worked in corporations that have 18 levels in them. This is just 3 levels in the middle. This could be Boeing. Boeing has a lot more levels than 3. How many levels of management will the manager of Unit 1.1 interact with? Hmm? 5, that's right. How do you get 5? He's on his boss's board, right? And his boss's board has his boss and his boss's boss. And he also has everybody else at his level. So there are 3 levels on his boss's board. But he's also on the board of each of his subordinates. And their subordinates have their subordinates on the board. So he's interacting with 2 levels up and 2 levels down and the others at his level. Even more than that, the highest level member on his board, which is his boss, and he's on his boss's board, the highest level member of his boss's board with whom he interacts is operating how many levels up? He's operating 2 more levels up. So through people that he interacts with, he has access to 4 levels up and 4 levels down. That's a characteristic of the system and has very important implications we want to look at as we go ahead. Now, I have to go backwards, and that means I have to go here. Every manager interacts with 5 different levels. Now, what are the functions of the board? No, it's okay. There are 6 functions of the board. The first one is every board plans for the unit whose board it is. This is a deviation from current practice. We have to stop using planners to plan, because most plans produced by planners are never implemented. There's a very simple rule. No manager will dedicate himself to the implementation of a plan which he doesn't feel he owns. And he never feels he owns a plan prepared by somebody else. So it's absolutely essential that the people who have to implement a plan do the planning. The function of the planner is to facilitate and serve as a resource for those who do the planning. Not to plan for them, but to enable them to plan for themselves more efficiently. And so each board does planning with the assistance of planners. The second thing they do is make policy. Policy are decision rules. There are laws and regulations. They are not decisions. Congress makes policy. The president makes decisions. The same division lies here. The manager is a decision maker, but his board makes policy, rules and regulations. That doesn't mean that the manager can't consult his board on decisions. He does all the time, in fact. But no matter how he consults the board, even if he takes a vote from it, responsibility for the decision is the manager's, it's not the board's. Responsibility for policy is the board's, not the manager's. The third function of the board is to coordinate the plans and policies made by the level below it. But who constitutes the plurality of the board that's coordinating the level below it? The manager of those units. So it's self-coordination with the participation of 2 higher levels of management. The fourth function is integration. You see, coordination is the management of horizontal interactions. Integration is the management of vertical interactions. And that's why it's important that each manager is interacting with 2 levels up and 2 levels down. That prevents a number of critical problems in most corporations from arising. Why? It turns out that at least half the problems any manager confronts is created by managers at a different level of the organization doing something, not intentionally to hurt him, but doing something which unintentionally has consequences that create problems at a different level. So when the University of Pennsylvania decided to start to overhead indirect expenses on research because it would increase the income of the universe significantly, they had no idea that this would put my research unit out of business. I called the vice president of finance and told him that. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because although I'm only one of 14 research units in the Wharton School, my travel bill was larger than the other 13 put together. Because my people cannot do their research in the Wharton School. They have to do it on site." And I cited the fact that our bill for airplanes alone for Anheuser-Busch that year was $72,000. I asked him, "Do you think they're going to allow me to put a 65% overhead on those airplane tickets?" I said, "Don't be silly." He said, "Of course not." He said, "But I can't change the accounting system. You'll have to work it out." Well, we did. But the point is that the decision that was made at the top was good for the university as a whole. But it was going to destroy me as a part. Not because they wanted to, which would have been a different matter, but because they didn't know what the impact of that decision would be on me. That can't happen here. Why not? We avoid that kind of thing. Because every board making a decision has a vision down 4 levels. And therefore they can see the impact down. And they avoid making decisions which are going to affect lower levels without consulting those levels. And the same thing is true for decisions going up. The fifth function of the board is the one areas where they're allowed to make decisions. Decisions which affect the quality of work life of the members of the board. Only for the members of the board. But these are incredibly important. These can have an unbelievable effect on the performance of an organization. I want to give you a few examples. Alcoa, Tennessee is the largest installation in the Alcoa Corporation. It was formed in 1906. It was unionized immediately by the United Steelworkers Union. Local 309, which has organized Alcoa, Tennessee, it was the largest local in the United Steelworkers Union. The installation consists of 3 rolling mills, each more than a mile long, that produce sheet aluminum, which during the war was used for the outer cover of airplanes, and is now primarily used for beverage containers, but also things like Venetian blinds and other things sheet aluminum is used for, including foil. That plant ran into serious trouble in the period following World War II for a very good reason. During World War II, Alcoa, Tennessee was turned over completely to the manufacturing of equipment to support the war effort. All of the work of Alcoa, Tennessee was done on cost-plus basis. Now, if you want an example of the ultimate irrationality of man, it's cost-plus compensation. Why? Well, the answer is obvious. If a company wants to increase its profit and it's on cost-plus, how do you do it? Increasing your costs. It's absolute nonsense. Well, nobody knew this better than the union. So the union began to press Alcoa for increases in wages and restrictive work rules. Now, this is literally true. At the end of the war in 1946, the hourly paid worker in Alcoa in Tennessee was paid more than twice as much as the second highest paid hourly worker in the state of Tennessee. If I told you how much he was making in 1946, you won't believe me, and I don't blame you. But he was making, with overtime, $42,000 a year. Well, when they had to convert to commercial production, they couldn't do it. They couldn't compete with Kaiser and Atlantic and other companies with that kind of labor cost. So management began to try to pull back what it had given labor during the war because of cost plus, and labor resisted. The result was a sequence of strikes. In 1978, they had the most serious one because the union loaded a freight car with dynamite and sent it into one of the plants and damn near destroyed it. The National Guard was called out and a number of people were killed. The corporate headquarters in Pittsburgh said, oh, the hell with this. You know, we've had enough of it. They announced that in 5 years, on December the 31st, 1984, that plant would be closed. Now, they had a certain amount of sympathy for the manager who was trying to run the place, so they relieved him. And they brought in a new manager to manage the demise of Alcoa, Tennessee. He was a young metallurgist from Australia. He was an American who had been working in Australia for Alcoa, and somebody with whom I had worked in Australia. So shortly after he got the job, he came to me and described it. He said, I am not allowed to spend a single penny for investment. I cannot replace anything. I can only repair with what I already have in stock. I have to run this place down into extinction in 5 years, minimizing political problems, despite the fact that we are the largest employer in the state of Tennessee. He said, I got an impossible job. He said, I've been asked to officiate at a wake, which will last for 5 years. He said, that's not only impossible, it's a bore. Now, I want to make the job interesting, he said. How can I change Pittsburgh's opinion? Well, to make a long story short, we discussed how we might do it, and he converted to this system I'm describing to you. On a completely voluntary basis, with the collaboration of the union, the shop floor, the hourly paid worker, was given the opportunity to participate on the board of the foreman. And 65% of the workforce signed up. Within 2 months, it was up to 85%, but originally it was 65%. What did they go to work on? Quality of work life, immediately. 2 of the workers, at the end of one of the production lines, made a change as a result of their participation in the board that saved the company $1.25 million a year. I heard about this when I came into the plant one day, and they were all excited about this modification in the handling of the aluminum cylinders. So I went down to see these 2 men. They were in their 50s. They had gone to work for Alcoa right out of high school, so they'd been employed by the company for about 25 years. They were proud as punch of what they had done. They puffed up like peacocks. And then I asked them a question which shut them up completely. I said, how long have you known about this? And they looked down and wouldn't answer me. And I kept pressing. And finally, one of them mumbled, 15 years. I said, my God, you mean you know about what you did 15 years ago and you didn't do it? You know, they said. I said, why? I'll never forget their answer. I quote them exactly. Those sons of bitches never asked me before. See, that's what that's about. When you've got subordinates that know how to do what they're doing better than you do, you better ask them. And this is the device for using the knowledge that your subordinates have in the task that they're given responsibility for doing. You see, one thing a professor learns in the college, if nothing else, is the students will do what you expect them to do. You might not believe that, but that's absolutely true. If you expect students to cheat in an examination, they will never disappoint you. But if you go into a class, as I've done many times, and said, look, if you cheat, I don't give a damn. You're not cheating me. You're cheating yourself. I'm going to leave, and you can do whatever the hell you want, but you got to take the exam. I can tell you nobody will cheat because you don't expect them to. Now, the same thing is true of workers. If you expect them to use everything they know in a job, they'll do it. But if you don't expect them to, if you expect them to be stupid, they'll be stupid because they don't want to disappoint you. This rule takes care of that. Now, the 6th and 7th functions are critical. Let me describe them briefly. Let's say this group of people are the subordinates on my board. Once a year, you will meet separately, and you have the following task. You're meeting without me. What do you suggest I do that will help you do your job better? Not what should I do to do my job better, but my subordinates tell me what they suggest I should do that will help them do their job better. And then I tell them what they should do that will help me do my job better. This leads to a collaboration between the manager and the subordinates where they're not adversarial, but complementary to each other. I gave a couple of examples yesterday. Let me repeat them briefly. The first board of this kind, the first use of this occurred at Anheuser-Busch a number of years ago when the 11 vice presidents who reported to August Bush and formed his board met with me to decide what August Bush should do that would enable them to do their jobs better. They came up with 18 suggestions. They decided that I should make the presentation to August Bush, since we had worked together for over 20 years, and he wouldn't do anything to me. He was a tough guy, and they were concerned about the consequences of being indirectly critical. So we met in the boardroom, with me at one end of the table, August at the other, and the 11 vice presidents around the two sides. I explained what we had been through to August and said, now the first item on our list, August, is vacations. And he immediately broke in. He said, what the devil are you talking about? We have one of the best vacation policies in the United States. Everybody in this room is entitled to 6 weeks. And if they don't take the 6 weeks, but work, they get double pay for the time they work when they could have been on vacation. When they're on vacation, they have the use of 3 vacation houses that we own in the north, south, and in the middle. They have the use of the ocean vessels that the company owns, 5 speedboats, and 2 helicopters. What the hell are they complaining about? He said to me. I said, oh, she didn't let me finish. He said, what else is there to say? I said, well, there's a couple questions to ask. Like what? He said. How many weeks did you take last year, August? He said, I didn't take them last year because we had this price war with Miller's, and I took a weekend. So what about the year before, August? Oh, he said, that was the year that we had the trouble with the brew up in the north, and I had to go up to the brewery and settle. I just took a couple days. I turned to the group, I said, how many of you took 4 weeks or more? Nobody raised their hands. How many of you took 2 weeks or more? Nobody raised their hands. How many of you took 1 week or more? 2 out of the 11 raised their hands. And August leaned over and he said, what's the matter with you guys? Why don't you take your vacations? And I said, August, why don't you answer that? And he turned cherry red, blushed. The first time I ever seen him blush. He said, my God. He said, you mean they don't take their vacations because I don't take mine and they think I'm going to hold it against them? I said, you got it. He said, I'm sorry. He said, I had no idea I was preventing you from taking vacation. I'm sorry, he said. I promise you I will take at least 4 weeks this year and every year from now on. And I want you to promise me the same. And that changed their behavior for over 20 years ago, and it's never changed since. You see, that changes the relationship between the manager and the subordinates because they were helping each other. The second item was entirely different. I said the second item on our list, August, is your vice presidents want more freedom to change the budget than they currently have because they constantly have to come to you for permission to make changes that are trivial. He said, that's not true. I said, what do you mean it's not true? He said, they don't need my approval for changes in the budget. I said, yes, they do. August said to me, Russ, he said, you know a hell of a lot about my job. You've been around here a very long time. But you don't know everything. Believe me, they do not need my approval. I said, August, it is true I know a lot about your job, and I know some things about your job that you don't know. And you do have to approve of them. He said, no, I don't. At which point, his secretary, Mickey, who's taking the minutes, leans over and whispers to him. And he says, I do. It's in the pile of paper she gives him that he signs automatically because she tells him his signature is needed, but he never reads them. He said, that's stupid. He said, let's cut that out. Of course you don't need my approval anymore. Now you see, you get enough decisions like this made in these meetings, and you get an effective collaboration between managers and their subordinates. His superior moved him out, and actually removed him and sent him up to Alaska. Normally it's not needed. Why? Because when the collaboration begins, you learn something very important. No matter how bad a manager is, if he has supportive subordinates, they can make him look good. No matter how good a manager is, if he has hostile subordinates, they can make him look bad. The performance of a manager depends more on the performance of his subordinates than it does on his own. And that becomes apparent in this system where they begin to work together instead of opposed to each other. Now, this democratization process raises a series of questions. I only want to take one or two and then let you ask any questions you have of it. The most commonly asked question is this. If a manager has 8 subordinates, he has 10 boards he has to participate in. 8 subordinate boards, his own board, and his boss's board. When does he get his work done? Now, there are 2 ways of dealing with that question. The typical board meets twice a month for 2 hours each time. They spend 4 hours a month in meetings. Now, this varies. If the boards consist of managers in different physical locations, they don't get together twice a month. For example, the Mars Corporation, where the managers in different regions are countries apart, they meet once a quarter for several days. So there's an adjustment and an adaptation to specific conditions. But the average is 4 hours a month. 4 hours a month for a manager who in principle works a 40-hour week, but that's not true. We know that managers in the United States work an average of 63-hour weeks, but let's consider 40 hours. If he's in meetings 4 hours and he works 40 hours, what percentage is that? If he works a 40-hour week and he meets in boards twice a month for 4 hours each, for 2 hours each, that's 4 hours out of 40 hours. And what percentage is that? 4 over 40 is what? 10%.
2 boards, 4 hours a week.
I'm sorry.
2 board meetings.
2 board meetings a month, each for 2 hours.
So it's 4 hours.
So it's 4 hours a month in boards. Now, if he's working a 40-hour
so that's 160 hours and 4 hours, so it works out. Yeah.
2.5%.
It's a very small percentage, right? But let's round it off. Let's make it higher. Say 10%. Okay. What percentage of his time does he spend managing? That sounds like a stupid question. He's a manager, isn't he? But Ross Weber did a study in the United States of managers who were asked the following question. What percentage of a manager's time is spent doing things he could not do unless he were a manager? And you'll never guess what that turned out to be. 17%. The rest of the time may be useful, but it doesn't require a manager to do what he does. Now, even if you take 10% and add it to 17, you get 27%. The real question is, what the hell does he do with the rest of his time? But that's a wise guy answer. The real answer lies in the fact that the average manager spends more time in meetings than he does alone. And the boards reduce that by at least 75% because it consolidates collective meetings into board meetings. And he gets increased time to do other things. And this has been the experience. It does not overload him. It creates more time for him to do some of the important things he has to do. The second question, and the last one I want to deal with, is does it take some training to have an effective board? And the answer is yes, it does. Most companies that introduce this system also introduce a training program in group dynamics, something like the training laboratory up in Bethel, Maine, or Matrix, or some 3-day program on sensitivity to group behavior. Most managers do not know how to handle a board. I had a fascinating experience along this line with Jim Reinhardt, who I've mentioned to you before, the chairman of Clark Equipment, who was a close personal friend. He was so smart that whenever an issue came up in the board, everybody would wait to hear what he had to say. And then they would essentially agree with him. Now, after this went on in the first board meeting for maybe an hour, I broke in. I said, Jim, you're going to have to leave the meeting. He said, what do you mean leave the meeting? I said, this isn't a board, this is a clack. I said, you won't shut up. So the only way to get you to shut up and for them to talk freely